Rescuers found them drifting in a boat filled with bones. They were not dead. They were gnawing on the skeletons of their friends. The captain was so delirious, he tried to hide the femurs in his pockets. This is the true nightmare behind Moby Dick. The silence is heavier than the water. It presses against the eardrums, a physical weight that drowns out the lap of waves against the hull. 4 skeletons sit in a cedar boat, drifting under a sun that acts less like a star and more like a weapon. It burns the skin into blisters that weep clear fluid, the only moisture left in their drying bodies. The air smells of salt and sweet rot. A hand reaches out. It does not look like a human hand anymore. It resembles a claw. The skin stretched so tight over the knuckles that the bone threatens to tear through. The fingers are stained black with grease and soot. They hover over a hat held upside down. Inside the hat are 4 strips of paper. The boy breathes in. The sound is a rattle, like dry leaves skittering on pavement. He is 18 years old. He pinches a strip of paper and pulls. The movement is slow, agonizing, as if the air itself is molasses. He turns the scrap over. It is short. It is the mark. The captain stands up. He sways, his legs too weak to hold him steady on the rolling floorboards. He wears the rags of a blue coat, the gold buttons tarnished green. He looks at the boy. He looks at the paper. Tears cut clean tracks through the grime on his face. He opens his mouth to speak, but his tongue is a swollen black sponge filling his oral cavity. He forces the words out. He offers to take the place of the boy. He begs to trade lives. But the boy shakes his head. The motion is small, resigned. The law of the sea has been invoked. The lottery is absolute. To refuse the result now would be to rob the others of their salvation. The pistol appears. It is a heavy thing, iron and wood, smelling of old oil. The barrel is hot to the touch. The boy rests his head against the gun wale of the boat, looking down into the deep, dark blue of the abyss. He does not pray. He does not cry. He simply waits. The captain raises the weapon. His hand shakes violently. He grips his own wrist with his other hand to steady the aim. The muzzle touches the temple of the boy. The metal is cool against the burning fever of the skin. The hammer clicks back with a mechanical snap that echoes across the empty horizon. In the split second before the trigger breaks, before the flash of powder and the spray of red, the mind reels back from the edge of madness to ask the impossible question. How did a hunt for oil turn into a harvest of blood? The calendar read November 20th, 1820. The location was the equator, a line of invisible fire drawn across the belly of the world. Here, the ocean does not roar. It breathes. The sailors call this place the Doldrums. The water is a flat sheet of polished obsidian reflecting a white sun that hammers down on the deck of the whale ship Essex. The sails hang limp, useless canvas ghosts against the rigging. The smell of boiling oil and old wood saturates the air. It is a perfect, tranquil prison. Then the silence breaks, not with wind, but with a sound from the deep. A geyser of mist erupts off the port bow. It is a sperm whale, but it is not like the others. It is a leviathan, a male of 85 feet, his skin scarred and gray like ancient stone. He does not flee. He floats, watching the ship with a small, intelligent eye. Then he moves, his tail, 20 feet wide, churns the water into white foam. He accelerates. The impact sounds like a cannon shot. Wood snaps. Copper sheathing shrieks as it tears. Men are thrown like dolls across the deck. The beast swims off, stunned. But he is not finished. He turns. He calculates. He gathers speed for a second run, a living torpedo made of 80 tons of muscle and rage. He strikes the bow again. This time, the destruction is absolute. The oak timbers shatter inward. The ocean rushes into the hold, eager to swallow the intruder. 10 minutes. That is all it takes to erase 21 years of history. The Essex groans and rolls over. The crew scrambles, hearts pounding against their ribs like trapped birds. They lower 3 fragile boats into the water. These are cedar shells, barely 27 feet long, designed to hunt, not to travel. They salvage what they can: 600 pounds of hardtack, a few navigation tools, a little water. They watch as their home, their fortress, slides beneath the surface, leaving them alone in a void of blue. Now comes the true tragedy. Not the wail, but the whisper of fear. Captain Pollard and First Mate Owen Chase spread a chart across their knees. To the west lie the Marquesas and the Society Islands. Safety is within reach, downwind and swift. But the men whisper of rumors. They speak of savages with filed teeth. They speak of fires and human flesh. They are terrified of cannibals. Driven by this phantom terror, they make a choice that seals their fate. They turn their backs on the islands. They turn their small, leaking boats toward the coast of South America. It is a journey of 3,000 miles. It is against the wind. It is against the currents. They choose the hard path to avoid a monster that exists only in their minds, unaware that they are carrying the seeds of that very monster inside their own bellies. The sails catch a faint breeze. The 3 boats form a tiny line, crawling slowly toward a hell of their own making. Land is a liar. After weeks of drifting through a blue purgatory, a shape rose from the sea. It was Henderson Island. To the starving men in the boats, it looked like heaven. It smelled of wet earth and green leaves. They wept as their feet touched the sand. They fell to their knees, not in prayer, but to claw at the ground, desperate for moisture. But the island was not a sanctuary. It was a trap. The geography of Henderson Island is cruel. It is a raised coral atoll, a jagged fortress of sharp rock that slices through boot leather and flays the skin from the soles of feet. There were birds, foolish nesting seabirds that did not know to fear men. The sailors caught them with their bare hands. They tore them apart, drinking the warm blood before it could clot, devouring the meat raw. For a moment, bellies were full, but the island had a secret. The fresh water was a lie. The spring was nothing more than a crack in the rock, a weeping sore that trickled only at low tide. Within days, the trickle died. The sun baked the white sand until it burned like embers. A dark realization settled over the crew. To stay here was to die. The birds were disappearing. The water was gone. The island was merely a larger, drier tomb than the boats. The debate was short and bitter. Most voted to return to the mercy of the open ocean, but 3 men refused. They looked at the endless horizon, then at the solid ground, and they could not force themselves back into the wooden shells. They chose the rock. They chose to wait for a rescue that might never come. The departure was a funeral for the living. The 3 castaways stood on the beach. three stick figures against a wall of white surf. They did not wave. They simply watched. The boats pushed off, the keels scraping against the coral with a sound like grinding teeth. The men in the boats rowed away, their necks craning back until the island shrank to a dot, then a speck, then nothing. The three men were erased by the curvature of the earth. Now the ocean decided to punish them for their hope. On the night of January 12th, the weather turned. The sky bruised purple and then black. The wind did not howl. It screamed. A squall hit the tiny flotilla with the force of a hammer. Rain fell in sheets, cold and stinging like buckshot. The waves rose into moving mountains, eclipsing the stars. In the chaos of foam and spray, the boats fought to stay together. They were tethered by invisible lines of sight, by shouts thrown into the gale. But the sea is vast, and the night is absolute. First Mate Chase looked over his shoulder. He searched for the silhouette of Captain Pollard's boat. He saw only the white teeth of a breaking wave. He listened for a voice, but heard only the roar of the wind tearing at the water. There was no goodbye. There was no final signal. In one violent surge of the Atlantic, the link was broken. The boats were scattered like dry leaves in a hurricane. Chase was alone. Pollard was alone. The darkness swallowed them whole. And for the first time, the silence of the ocean was more terrifying than the storm. The true descent had begun. The sun was no longer a celestial body. It was a torturer. It hung directly overhead, a blinding white eye that never blinked. There was no shade in the open boats. The men curled beneath the thwarts, pressing their faces into the bilge water, but the heat found them. It cooked them in their own skins. The physical decay was rapid and absolute. The salt spray and the solar radiation combined to create a unique plague. Great yellow boils erupted on the skin of the sailors. They swelled until they covered shoulders and backs, tight balloons of fluid that burst at the slightest touch, leaving raw, weeping craters. Their lips cracked open. Bleeding fissures that would not heal. Inside their mouths, the tongues swelled. They grew thick and heavy, filling the oral cavity until the men could no longer close their jaws. They breathed in shallow gasps, their throats constricted by their own flesh. When they urinated, the liquid was dark and viscous, the color of coffee or old blood. The kidneys were failing. The body was beginning to consume its own organs to keep the heart beating. Hunger is a madness. It is a sharp claw in the gut that eventually dulls into a hollow, aching void. When the bread was gone, they looked to the boat itself. They leaned over the gunwales, their skeletal hands dipping into the water to scrape the hull. They found gooseneck barnacles clinging to the wood. They tore the crustaceans free and crushed them between their teeth, swallowing the shells, the grit, and the slime. It was not enough. The hallucinations began. Men saw feasts spread out on the waves. They saw fresh streams of water pouring from the clouds. They reached out to grasp phantom loaves of bread, only to close their hands on empty air. Then came the silence of the first death. A body lay on the floorboards. It was no longer a shipmate. It was an object. In any other time, in any other place, this shell would have been sewn into canvas and weighted with iron, sent down to the darkness of the deep with a prayer. The survivors looked at the body. They looked at the empty ocean. They looked at each other. The taboo, the oldest law of civilization, dissolved under the pressure of survival. To throw this sustenance away would be suicide. The work was performed with a terrifying mechanical efficiency. There was no ceremony. There was only the sound of a knife sawing through leather and tendon. The logic of the butcher shop took over. The limbs were separated. The torso was opened. The heart and the liver were removed and eaten immediately, raw and warm. The life force transferred from the dead to the living in a primal communion. But the horror did not end with the consumption. It was in the preparation. They feared disease. They feared the very flesh that was saving them. So they took the strips of muscle, the meat of their friend, and they leaned over the side of the boat. They washed the human flesh in the sea. They rinsed it in the salt water, scrubbing away the blood, trying to wash away the sin. Then they laid the strips on the boat thwarts to dry in the sun. The same sun that was killing them now cured their meal. The boat became a floating charnel house, festooned with the drying remains of the crew. They sat among the meat. They watched it turn brown and hard. And when the hunger returned, they ate, chewing slowly, eyes fixed on the horizon, weeping as they swallowed. By the 90th day, time had ceased to exist. There were no hours, no minutes, only the binary rhythm of suffering. Light meant burning, dark meant freezing. The men in the boats were no longer sailors. They were feral things, creatures of instinct whittled down to a single biological imperative: eat or die. The ocean stretched out in every direction, a blue desert that had swallowed their past and erased their future. On February 18th, a shape broke the monotony of the horizon. It was not a cloud, it was hard edges and straight lines. It was the British brig Indian. From the deck, the lookout spotted a speck bobbing in the swells. As the ship drew closer, the crew gathered at the rail. Silent, they smelled it before they saw it. The scent of death, of sweet rot and old blood, drifted across the water. Inside the drifting vessel, 3 figures lay amidst a pile of debris. They were Owen Chase and his 2 remaining companions. They did not cheer. They did not wave. They were too weak to lift their heads. When the rescuers hauled them aboard, the survivors simply wept. Their tears were the only moisture left in their bodies. They collapsed on the deck, skeletal and trembling, unable to comprehend that the nightmare had paused, but the ocean was not finished. 5 days later, on February the 23rd, the whale ship Dauphin cut through the swells to the south. The lookout cried out, "Another boat." It drifted aimlessly, spinning slowly in the current. The captain of the Dauphin lowered a skiff to investigate. The sailors rowed in silence, their oars dipping into the glassy water. As they approached the derelict craft, the air grew heavy. The silence from the whaleboat was absolute. The rescuers pulled alongside and looked over the gunwale. What they saw stopped the breath in their throats. The bottom of the boat was a charnel house. It was littered with bones, human bones, femurs, ribs, skulls. They were picked clean, white and polished by the sun and by teeth. Amidst this boneyard, 2 creatures were curled up in opposite ends of the boat. They were Captain George Pollard and Charles Ramsdell. They did not look up. They did not notice the large ship casting a shadow over them. They did not notice the faces of the men staring down in horror. They were busy. They were gnawing on the bones of their shipmates. The sound was distinct in the quiet air. The wet, frantic clicking of teeth against calcium. They sucked at the marrow. Their eyes glazed over with a madness that went deeper than the ocean floor. They were no longer men waiting for rescue. They were scavengers protecting a kill. The sailors from the Dauphin called out. Pollard slowly raised his head. His beard was matted and long, reaching his chest. His skin was parchment stretched over a skull. His eyes were wide, but they held no recognition. He did not see saviors. He saw thieves. Panic seized him. In a final, heartbreaking act of delirium, the captain of the Essex did not reach for a helping hand. He reached for the bones. He grabbed the splintered remains of his cousin. He shoved the knuckles and the shards into his pockets. He clutched them to his chest, his knuckles white, terrified that these strangers had come to steal his food. It took force to separate them from the dead. They were lifted from the blood-stained wood, light as birds, their bodies wasted away to almost nothing. But even as they were carried up the side of the Dauphin, safe at last, their hands kept patting their pockets, checking to make sure the bones were still there. The body had been rescued, but the mind was still adrift, lost somewhere back in the dark. Hungry water. The port of Valparaiso so was a riot of color and noise. To the survivors, it was an alien planet. They walked on steady ground, but their legs still compensated for the roll of the ocean. They ate warm bread, but their stomachs cramped, remembering the taste of human liver. They were alive, yet they carried a silence within them that no laughter could penetrate. The reunion was not a celebration. It was a gathering of ghosts who had somehow retained their flesh. The final act of rescue played out on the other side of the world. An Australian merchant ship, the Surrey, was dispatched to the lonely rock of Henderson Island. The captain expected to find corpses. Instead, he found 3 scarecrows standing on the white sand. They had survived on shellfish and rainwater, clinging to the jagged coral for months. When the boat approached, they did not speak. They simply stared, their minds eroded by the wind, the sole inhabitants of a kingdom of guano and heat. The roster of the living was complete, but the story did not end at the dock. It followed them home to Nantucket. Captain George Pollard returned to the sea. It was the only life he knew, but the ocean had marked him. It had tasted him and spat him out, and it wanted nothing more to do with him. On his very next command, the ship, 2 brothers, wrecked on a coral reef. The town of Nantucket turned its back. They called him a Jonah. They whispered that he was cursed, stripped of his rank. The man who had eaten his cousin to survive ended his days on land. He became a night watchman. Every evening, as the fog rolled in off the harbor, George Pollard walked the cobblestones with a lantern in his hand. He walked the dark streets, a ghost haunting his own life, listening to the waves crash against the pier, safe, dry, and utterly defeated. First mate Owen Chase chose a different path. He wrote his account. He married. He became a successful captain. He seemed to have defeated the demon, but trauma is a patient predator. It waits in the blood. In his old age, the madness returned. It did not come as a wail, but as a hunger that could not be sated. Chase began to buy food. He bought flour, beans, and hardtack. He did not eat it. He hid it in his attic. Family members would find him there in the dead of night, a trembling old man weeping over a stash of crackers, terrified that the supplies would run out. The starvation of the boat had never left him. It had simply waited for his mind to weaken. The men of the Essex eventually died in their beds. Their bones were buried in the earth, far from the reach of sharks. The story became a legend, a grim fable told to frighten young sailors. But the ocean remembers nothing. Return to the coordinates where the ship went down. There is no marker. There is no debris. The water is deep and blue and indifferent. The great sperm whale, the architect of their doom, is long gone, dissolved into the salt. The wind blows over the empty waves, singing the same song it sang before the first ship ever sailed. The sea does not hate. The sea does not love. It simply is. And that is the terrifying truth. We are intruders in a world that does not know our names.